For years, I lived door to door with a woman I barely noticed, even though our lives were quietly running side by side. Everything changed the night she knocked on my door by mistake, tired and unsure, holding her keys in her hand. What started as a small accident slowly uncovered feelings we had both been carrying without knowing it. Sometimes, the love that changes your life has been waiting right across the hall all along. Hello, my name is Dale. I am 35 years old, and I live in a quiet apartment building on the edge of the city. I work as a business analyst for a consulting company. Most days I work from home, sitting at a desk near the window, looking at spreadsheets, reports, and numbers that explain how other people's businesses work. My life is stable, predictable, and mostly calm. I have lived in this building for almost 6 years. After my divorce, I wanted a place that was simple and quiet. No noise, no drama, just somewhere I could come home after work and feel at ease. I got used to living alone. I wake up early, make coffee, check emails, and plan my day. In the evenings, I cook simple meals, watch documentaries, or read. On weekends, I sometimes go for long walks or visit my parents who live an hour away. My neighbors have always been part of the background of my life. We nodded at each other in the hallway, exchanged polite hellos near the elevator, and that was it. We knew who lived where, but not much more. One of those neighbors was Alina. Alina lived in the apartment directly across from mine. I knew her face, her name from the mailbox, and that she often came home late. She was usually wearing a jacket with animal hair on it, and carried a tired but gentle expression. Sometimes I saw her with a dog, sometimes with a cat carrier. I guess she worked with animals, but we never talked long enough for me to ask. She seemed kind, always polite, but distant in the way busy people often are. We had our routines. We passed each other, smiled briefly, and continued on with our lives. I never thought much about it. She was just my neighbor. Looking back, it feels strange how two people can live so close for so long and remain strangers. We shared a wall, the same hallway, the same sounds of doors opening and closing. Yet our lives ran parallel, never crossing. That evening started like any other. It was a Tuesday. I finished work around 7, closed my laptop, and made myself a simple dinner. The building was quiet. Outside, it was already dark, and the rain tapped softly against the windows. I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt. I was sitting on the couch when I heard a knock. At first, I thought I imagined it. Visitors were rare. I checked the time, then heard it again. A hesitant knock, not too loud, not too confident. I stood up, slightly annoyed, slightly curious, and walked to the door. When I opened it, I was surprised. Alina stood there, holding her keys in her hand. Her hair was tied back, her jacket half unzipped, and she looked confused and embarrassed at the same time. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then she blinked and let out a small laugh. She apologized immediately, saying she thought this was her apartment. She had been distracted, tired after a long shift at the clinic, and didn't even realize she was at the wrong door. I told her it was fine. It could happen to anyone. She smiled, but then her expression changed. She looked down at her keys and admitted that something was wrong with her lock. The key would not turn properly, and she didn't know what to do. Normally, I would have offered advice and closed the door. I am not the type of person who gets involved easily. But something about the situation felt different. Maybe it was the way she looked genuinely unsure, or maybe it was just the quiet of the evening that made everything feel more personal. I asked if she wanted some help. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. That was the first time we truly spoke to each other. Not as neighbors passing in the hallway, but as two people standing in the same space, sharing a small problem, unaware that this simple mistake was about to change much more than just an ordinary evening. I invited Alina inside, feeling slightly awkward as I stepped aside to let her pass. She hesitated for a second, then entered, holding her keys tightly as if she was not fully convinced this was a normal thing to do. I closed the door behind her, and the apartment suddenly felt different, less empty than it usually did. She apologized again, explaining that long shifts often left her distracted. She told me she worked as a veterinarian at a local clinic and that this week had been especially exhausting. There were emergencies, sick animals, worried owners, and not enough staff. As she spoke, she took off her jacket and placed it carefully over the back of a chair, like someone used to being considerate even when tired. I offered her tea. She smiled and said yes, admitting that she had not eaten properly all day. While I filled the kettle, I realized how strange it was to hear her voice for the first time in a real conversation. We had lived across from each other for years, yet this was the first moment that felt personal. We sat at the small kitchen table. Nothing fancy. 2 cups, a plate with leftover cookies I had bought days earlier, and the soft hum of the refrigerator. She thanked me for the tea and looked around, saying my place felt calm. I told her that was exactly why I chose it after my divorce. The word came out naturally, without planning. She nodded, not asking questions, just listening. She explained that she had moved into the building shortly after finishing her studies. Her job was demanding, but she loved it. Animals made sense to her. They did not lie, and they did not pretend to be something they were not. People, she said quietly, were more complicated. There was no heavy silence between us. The conversation flowed in a simple, natural way. We talked about the building, the strange noises at night, the old elevator that sometimes stopped between floors. We laughed softly, careful not to be too loud. It felt like a shared secret, this unexpected evening. After a while, we went into the hallway to look at her door. The lock resisted at first, then finally turned with a sharp click. I adjusted it as best I could with the limited tools I had. It was not perfect, but it would hold until a locksmith could come. She watched closely, thanking me more than once. When it was done, she let out a relieved breath and leaned against the wall for a moment. That was when I noticed how tired she really was. Not just physically, but in a deeper way, like someone who carried responsibility alone for a long time. Before she went back inside her apartment, she paused. She looked at me, hesitating, then said she was glad it had been my door she knocked on by mistake. I answered honestly that I was glad too. It surprised me how true it felt. We said goodnight and closed our doors. I stood in my hallway for a few seconds, listening to the familiar silence return. But it did not feel the same anymore. Something had shifted, subtle but real. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how easily the evening had unfolded. No expectations, no pressure, just 2 people talking. I realized I knew more about her in 1 hour than I had learned in 6 years of polite greetings. The next morning, I saw her again by the elevator. This time, the smile was different. Warmer. She asked if the lock was still holding. I said it was. We exchanged a few words, then went our separate ways, but the brief moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Over the following days, small things began to change. We ran into each other more often, or at least it felt that way. A short conversation here, a shared smile there. Once, she left a note by my door thanking me again for the help. Another time, I held the elevator for her without thinking. Neither of us said anything about that evening, but it was there between us, unspoken. The silence we had lived with for years was no longer empty. It was filled with something new, something fragile, waiting to be understood. The days after that evening began to feel different, even though nothing obvious had changed. I still worked from home, still followed my routines, still lived the same quiet life. But now there was an awareness I had not felt before. Every sound in the hallway made me pause. Every time I opened my door, part of me wondered if I would see Alina. We began running into each other more often. Or maybe we always had, and I just had not noticed before. In the mornings, she sometimes stood by the elevator with a coffee cup in her hand, her hair still slightly messy from rushing out. We exchanged more than just a greeting now. She asked how my work was going. I asked about her clinic. The conversations were short, but real. One evening, I came home to find a small paper bag hanging from my door handle. Inside were 2 pastries and a note. She thanked me again for helping with the lock and wrote that she had picked them up on her way home. It was a simple gesture, but it stayed with me all night. I realized how rare it was for someone to do something thoughtful without expecting anything in return. A few days later, I saw her struggling with grocery bags near the entrance. I offered to help, and she accepted without hesitation. As we walked up the stairs together, she talked about her day. A long surgery, a difficult decision, a pet owner who cried in her arms. She tried to sound calm, but I could hear how much it affected her. When we reached her door, she took a deep breath and thanked me, not just for the bags, but for listening. That was when she started opening up more. Not all at once, but in small pieces. She told me she had moved to the city alone, that her work left little room for a social life, and that most of her energy went to caring for others. I told her about my marriage, how it slowly fell apart without anger, just distance and silence. Saying it out loud felt strange, but also relieving. There was comfort in these conversations. No pressure to impress, no need to pretend. We were just two people sharing ordinary truths. Sometimes we talked for 5 minutes, sometimes for 20. Once, we stood in the hallway so long that the light turned off, and we laughed when it suddenly went dark. I noticed things about her I had not seen before. The way she listened without interrupting. How her face softened when she talked about animals. How she sometimes looked tired but never bitter. And I became aware of myself too. I started choosing cleaner shirts when I knew I might see her. I caught myself looking forward to simple encounters that once meant nothing. At the same time, doubt crept in. I reminded myself that we were neighbors, that getting involved could complicate things. I told myself it was just friendliness, just comfort born from familiarity. But then she texted me one afternoon, asking if a package had been delivered to my door by mistake. Seeing her name on my phone made my heart beat faster, and I knew I was lying to myself. One evening, she knocked on my door again. This time, there was no mistake. She held her phone up and showed me a picture of her dog looking guilty next to a torn pillow. She asked if I had any advice, half joking, half tired. I invited her in, and we sat at the kitchen table again, just like the first night. That evening felt easy, familiar. We talked about small things, about plans we never made, about how strange it was that we had lived so close for so long without knowing each other. There was a pause at one point, a silence that felt full rather than empty. I wanted to say something important, but I did not know what it was yet. When she left, she stopped at the door and smiled at me in a way that made my chest tighten. She said she was glad we talked. I said the same. After she closed her door, I stood there longer than necessary, aware that something was growing between us, something neither of us had named. That night, I realized the truth. We were no longer just neighbors who happened to talk. We were paying attention to each other. And once you truly notice someone, it becomes impossible to go back. After that evening, something quiet but undeniable settled between us. We did not talk about it directly, but it showed in small, ordinary moments. We began planning our days around each other without saying so. If I knew Alina worked late, I stayed up longer. If she knew I was working from home, she sometimes knocked during her break just to say hello. One Friday evening, she texted and asked if I would like to have dinner together. Nothing special, she wrote. Just something simple. I agreed immediately, though I tried to act calm about it. She came over carrying a small bag with groceries, apologizing for not planning ahead. I told her it was perfect. We cooked together in my kitchen. There was nothing romantic about it at first. We stood side by side, chopping vegetables, talking about our week. She told me about a difficult case at the clinic, an older dog whose owners could not decide what was best. I listened, noticing how carefully she chose her words, how much responsibility she carried. I told her about a project at work that felt endless, numbers that never seemed to add up no matter how much effort I put in. Dinner was simple. Pasta, salad, a bottle of wine we shared slowly. We sat across from each other at the table, relaxed, comfortable. At one point, she laughed and said it felt strange how normal everything felt. I knew exactly what she meant. There was no tension, no performance. Just ease. After we finished eating, we did not rush to clean up. We stayed at the table, talking about things that mattered more. She admitted that she often felt lonely, even though she was always surrounded by people at work. I told her I understood that kind of loneliness, the kind that comes from having no one to come home to. Saying it out loud made my chest tighten. There was a pause then. A long one. Not awkward, but heavy. I looked at her and realized I had been thinking about this moment for days. I told her the truth. That I had started looking forward to seeing her more than I wanted to admit. That I felt something growing, and it scared me because I had promised myself not to rush into anything again. She listened without interrupting. Then she said she had felt the same. That she had noticed it long before that evening, but did not know what to do with it. She said she was afraid of changing what we had, afraid of ruining something good before it had a chance to grow. We sat there, the space between us filled with everything we had not said before. When she reached for my hand, it felt natural, not dramatic. Just two hands finding each other after a long wait. We did not rush. We stayed like that, holding hands, breathing slowly, letting the moment settle. That night, nothing more happened. No promises, no big declarations. Just honesty. When she left, she stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at me as if memorizing my face. She said she was glad we talked. I told her I was too. Over the next weeks, our connection deepened quietly. We spent more time together, Not because we planned it, but because it felt right. Walks in the evening, grocery shopping together, sitting on the couch after long days, talking about everything and nothing. We learned each other's habits. I learned how she liked her coffee. She learned when I needed silence. There were moments of doubt. Moments when I wondered if I was ready, if I could open myself again after everything I had been through. She had her doubts too. Sometimes she pulled back slightly, not because she wanted to leave, but because she was careful. We talked about it openly, without blame. That was new for both of us. One night, after a particularly long shift, she came over exhausted and upset. A patient she cared deeply about had not made it. She did not cry immediately. She just sat beside me, silent. I put my arm around her, and she leaned into me, finally letting go. In that moment, I understood something clearly. This was not just affection. This was trust. From then on, there was no pretending. We were together, not loudly, not officially, but in every way that mattered. The feelings we had ignored for years, living so close without seeing each other, had finally found their place. Time passed in a quiet, steady way. Not the kind of time filled with dramatic turns, but the kind that slowly builds something real. Alina and I did not rush anything. We continued living in our own apartments at first, but most evenings ended in the same place. Sometimes at my kitchen table, sometimes on her couch, sometimes walking together through the neighborhood after a long day. Our relationship settled into something calm and dependable. We learned how to be part of each other's lives without losing ourselves. I supported her when her work became overwhelming. Late nights, difficult cases, moments when she questioned whether she could keep doing it. I listened, held her, reminded her why she chose this path. She supported me too, especially when work pressure piled up and I retreated into myself. She noticed when I was distant and gently pulled me back. Small routines became important. Morning coffee together on weekends. Grocery shopping where we argued lightly about what we really needed. Quiet evenings where we did not talk much, just shared the same space. These moments mattered more than any big gesture. One evening, as we sat at her place, she mentioned that her lease would end in a few months. She said it casually, but I felt the weight of it. I realized that the thought of her not living across the hall unsettled me more than I expected. That night, after a long pause, I asked her how she would feel about us living together. She did not answer immediately. She thought about it carefully, the way she always did. Then she said yes. Not excited, not dramatic. Just certain. That was how we made most decisions together. Calmly. Honestly. We chose my apartment. It was slightly bigger, better for her animals, and closer to the clinic. The move was simple. A few boxes, a few trips across the hallway. Still, it felt like a big step. The first night she officially stayed, the apartment felt different. Lived in. Warm. Living together was not perfect, but it was real. We had small disagreements. About schedules. About space. About silence. But we talked through everything. We did not let things build up the way they had in our past relationships. We learned to listen, even when it was uncomfortable. Months later, one quiet Sunday morning, we sat at the table drinking coffee. Sunlight filled the room. There was no special occasion, no planned speech. I looked at her and realized I could not imagine my life without her. Not just as a partner, but as family. I told her that. Simply, I said I wanted to build a future together. Not just live together, but commit fully. She listened, smiled softly, and said she felt the same. That she had never felt this safe, this understood. We did not rush a wedding or make grand promises. We agreed on something deeper. We chose each other, consciously, every day. We talked about the future. A home. Maybe children. A life that made room for both of us. Sometimes I still think about that evening when she knocked on my door by accident. How close we were for so many years without knowing what we could be to each other. Love did not appear suddenly. It had been there quietly, waiting for the right moment. We were no longer just neighbors. We were partners. We were family.